Hey everyone, it's Electra. Thank you for watching. It is time for, you know it, another sunset chat. And I am back home, relatively rested after my round robin of the mid and upper Midwest through Illinois, Wisconsin, and back to St. Louis. Uh, it's not as hot here. There's been a cool down in general over the whole Midwest. I understand the West Coast is extremely hot right now, but as tends to happen whenever a heat wave strikes the West Coast, east of the Rockies tends to cool off, and that's what's happened here in the Midwest. It's really nice, and especially up in Illinois, and it was really nice for late August. There was definitely a chill in the air at night and felt like fall already. And so what's going on? Been thinking a lot about what kind of coalition needs to form for there to be any kind of competitive adversary to the fascist bloc in our culture and society and political system. And had some thoughts just like when I was up in Wisconsin, I went to an ice cream custard place called Kops, Kopps, and I didn't have anything because I'm vegan. They didn't have any vegan options, unfortunately. But what do you expect for Wisconsin, right? Land of dairy. And one thing I noticed how is this was in the middle of the city of Milwaukee. I think it was actually in a sub. It was like in a very inner suburb called maybe Greenfield. It was like right on the line between Greenfield and Milwaukee. So, and Milwaukee's not a big city, so this was only maybe less than 5 to 10 miles from downtown Milwaukee. And I noticed how many like teenage kids there were. I guess there were at least 16 because they seemed to be there without parents. And there were just a lot of them. I feel like I don't see that in St. Louis, like even out in the outskirts, which I hardly ever go to if I don't have to. But at the frozen custard place here in St. Louis called Ted Drew's, which is just a local landmark, and you would never see that many teenagers there. So, like, let's think about demographically. How do you, well, ultimately, if you're going to win this politically, you need to have people from really all parts of the political spectrum. That's how the original Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and the party that defeated slavery, won the Civil War, they were able to win in 1860 and elect Lincoln because they had elements of the entire political spectrum. They were not just a radical abolitionist party. They definitely had that wing. That was the radical Republican wing of New England. People like Charles Sumner, who was kind of like they were good at provoking the Southern Democrats. They were good at really just like getting their goat. And Charles Sumner was so good at it that he got caned by a Southern Democrat from South Carolina named Preston Brooks. He was beaten with Charles Sumner was beaten by Preston Brooks and Preston Brooks was using his cane. So this was like 1857 or 58, I think, like a year, two, three before the Civil War at the absolute most. So that's kind of that was really a unique thing. And I'm thinking, like, what does this have to do with these teenagers? You're wondering probably, right? What I think it has to do with these teenagers in Milwaukee is these are exactly the people that a new political party or some sort of reinvented Democratic Party, I would prefer the name Democratic, get just removed. I don't think that's going to work in the parts of the country that need to be swayed. And I'm of the mind that people do need to be swayed. The coalition the Democrats currently have aren't cutting it, obviously. They are either not dependable enough to vote, or yeah, that's basically what it comes down to. It's not that they don't have enough people; they just don't have the people that are dependable to vote because they care enough to do it. So, are these teenagers in Milwaukee going to care enough to do it? I don't know, but these are the people that we need to be getting our message out to. These are the people that are going to be victim number one in terms of what their future is. They have the most years ahead of them in, with this world in store for them if we don't do what our duty is as in the older generations. We need to be the elders here that the boomers completely failed to be. The boomers have massively failed this culture. They have been the worst elder generation, perhaps ever, in a modern society. But that doesn't mean we have to be. Those that are, let's say, 40 years old, between 40 and 60, 40 and 70, we can change that. We don't have to be like the boomers. We don't have to be just mindless consumers that accrue money and care about their bank accounts above all else. Not saying there's younger people that are not like that, but I think in general, we have had to learn how to not be like that because we haven't had the money to become that way. We've been forced to approach life from other angles. So back to the kids in Milwaukee. So these kids, okay, like I don't see them being MAGA, but I also don't see them being Democrats as we think of them. Would they have voted for Kamala? I don't know. But they need to be able to vote for somebody that is against fascism, makes it clear they're against fascism, makes it clear that they are for that group of people. There needs so building a coalition that's going to actually vote against fascism and support or not just non-fascists, but anti-fascists, people that are ready to fight and take personal risks and risk potential prison and jail time to fight fascism. That's what it's going to take. We can't fight this safely. And I think if people start, if our candidates and elected officials begin to act this way, it is going to inspire the public. And you have to inspire people to get them to vote for you. That is something that Democrats have failed to do since Obama. I also think like a critical contingent of people that we need to sway is perhaps former Republicans that voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012. I think that is a critical demographic because it shows that they're not racist, asshole MAGA people. If someone voted for George W. Bush twice and then Obama at least once, preferably twice, of course, I think that shows a couple things. It shows that they have a brain. They're not afraid to use it. They're not afraid to vote for change if they think it's inspiring enough to happen, which I think we all felt that in 2008. If you didn't, I think it's clear which camp you're in right now, probably. So yeah, I guess more like old school, pre-Trump Republicans, even people that voted for Romney in 2012 are probably swayable. Those are going to be more middle-aged people, obviously, because no one under the age of probably, well, if you were 18 in 2012, you would have been born in 94. So yeah, that'd be a 31-year-old right now. So no one under the age of 31 could possibly have voted for Obama. Of course, they wouldn't have voted for Republicans either before that. So really, we're looking at like 40 and under millennials. And so back to the infant Republican Party of 1856 and 1860. How did they, well, first of all, be aware that they lost their first presidential election in 1856. Their nominee was John C. Fremont. And he was like he was from California, which at the time was a tiny state. It had only been a state for about 10 years, had not much of a population, and it was actually a Democratic state, which back then were like the Republicans now, the more conservative party. So Fremont was their first nominee. Lincoln was still a relatively unknown Illinois lawyer, and was in 1856 was still 2 years away from making the Lincoln Douglas speeches with Stephen A. Douglas running for the Illinois Senate. I believe it was. Yeah, not either the House or Senate, but I think it was the Senate. And what helped? So what took them in 1856? They were a more radical party because they were composed more of the New England radical abolitionists, and the West, which at the time was like the Midwest now, places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Missouri. These were places that were the West. And these were the states that were like considered kind of like the frontier at the time. And so, the radical abolitionist, radical Republican values of New England that didn't translate well to the West. The West was much less developed, much more conservative. Democrats were the clear party of choice. Even in Illinois, people like Stephen A. Douglas were the people of choice. I mean, Lincoln fought an uphill battle in Illinois as as a Whig, and the Whigs were like the kind of the Democrats at that of now. But so where am I going? Got a lot of thoughts here, a lot of thought strings and threads going. And how did they win in 1860? They elected Lincoln because they didn't lose the radical abolitionists in New England. What they did do is they cultivated former Northern Democrats that were mostly anti-slavery, but they weren't nearly as they didn't care about it nearly as much as the abolitionists, of course. But they had to figure out they had more in common with a Northern Republican than they did with a Southern Democrat. That was kind of the challenge that the Republicans dealt with in the lead up to 1860. So they did that by there was some appeal to moral values. There was Lincoln was not really an abolitionist, at least not a radical abolitionist, even though he was anti-slavery. He was much more moderate on the issue, and at least in front of like the voters. And when he was campaigning, he was known as a moderate. The radicals didn't think he was liberal enough. The conservative wing, which was being cultivated, also didn't think that they thought he was too liberal, too radical. So that's like the true definition of a centrist. I think today we're using the word centrist as somebody that is like halfway between the Democratic Party and the fascist party, formerly known as the Republicans. I don't think that to me is not a proper use of the word centrist. To me, a centrist is like one party should have a spectrum. You have the radical left, and then you have the conservative right, and then a centrist is somewhere that's in that ideological spectrum. I think that's the difference, is the ideology has to be you have to have the same basic ideology, or else it doesn't matter. The Republican Party was inherently anti-slavery, and that was what tied them all together. That's what made a radical New Englander like Charles Sumner that's what allowed him to be in the same party with, like, let's say, the Blairs, like Frank Blair, I guess, of Missouri. They didn't have a whole lot in common, but they had just enough in common to consider themselves Republicans in 1860 and thereafter. So while I don't think we can change a lot of minds these days of some people that are definitely on the MAGA side, I think there are people that are not MAGA. I think Kamala Harris tried to do this last year, but failed very, very, very badly by doing some very foolhardy things. Things that I think were way too conservative, even for this moderate middle, that are inherently liberal, but just not radical far left and not super conservative left, like, say, Joe Biden. And So what's going to make people start doing something? I think I alluded to it earlier when I mentioned the beating of Charles Sumner on the floor of the United States Senate in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. I think this is what has to happen for more people to start to see on the nightly news, people that still watch that, like my boomer parents. They have no clue what's going on in the world. They have no idea they live in a fascist state, the state of Texas. I tried to speak to my mom today. I was inspired by the fact I visited her birth city and I saw the home she grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on this recent road trip. And I really wanted to just have a serious talk to her and talk with her heart to heart. And I asked her, like, when the day comes, like, where do you want to be? Where, you know, do we? I asked if she had a will. I asked if, like, she had instructions in terms of, like, what do we do with her remains, and my dad too. And she, my typical mom, she's like, oh, it doesn't really matter. I just I just want to be cremated. She had like no real opinion about anything because that's just how she's always been. And I think at this point it's to her detriment. She is living in a fascist state. I tried telling her, like, you and dad, like, you got to get out of there. You just don't belong there anymore. I don't think they realize that. They're so caught in this, there's just so much in this retirement bubble that they don't really have to deal with the consequences of where they are. They're privileged enough where my mom was actually able to say and believe that that things never really change in politics, and there's nothing that's serious enough. Like I was telling her, like, you need to get out of there. Like things are going to go downhill at some point very soon. Maybe not this year, but definitely like sometime next year. And she was like, oh, what do you think's going to happen? And I'm just like, well, they're either going to like become another country again. You're going to be caught in a country that's not going to let you out at that point. And like, yeah, could I be a little alarmist right now? Sure, but sometimes thinking of the worst case scenarios are good just for brainstorming processes. And yeah, so they're there because their home's paid off. They're paying just a flat property tax every year on this house they've lived in for 35 years, since I was 9 years old. But yeah, they basically give Texas $7,000 a year to have this house on this property. So I don't like that. I don't like that they're funding a fascist government, but they just have noted they don't. Yeah, I don't know. How do other people? Does anybody else have parents that are either just like so cut off from the outside world, they're caught in this retirement bubble where they never really have to see the consequences of anything that's happened over the last 6-7 years? That's how they've been retired for well, my mom's been retired 13 years. My dad, not as long. My dad was, I think, retired like 2016, 17. And in a way, I admire the fact that they don't have to pay attention to anything. But when my mom said, like, nothing really changes, they all get up, they all like fight, but yet nothing really ever changes. And I was like, well, things have changed for me this year. Things have changed for all American women, especially Texan women that can no longer have abortions. That's been but she's 75, she's retired, she's financially relatively